Welcome back, everyone, to the sixth and final installment of our look at the First Crusade through the eyes of extra history. If you have not seen the first 5 episodes of my reaction, the link's in the description to take you back to the beginning. The link is also there for the original content without my commentary. Please go over and support them for the great work they've done in putting this together. As I say all the time, with Extra History, they're one of my favorite channels to do reactions to because I love how they tell a story, which has always been my passion in history, is not just looking at the events and names and dates and places, but really trying to understand what they were feeling and experiencing. And I think they do a great job of helping us to experience that, as much as you can do in an 8-minute video, but I think it's well done. So I've learned a lot that I did not know before about all of this, and I'm excited to see how the story ends. So join me as we dive into part 6.
Last we left off, the Crusaders had just taken Antioch. Now they have to hold it. There's just a small series of problems. 1, the Turkish army bearing down on them has now surrounded Antioch. 2, the Turkish garrison in Antioch still holds the citadel, which is inside the city walls. 3, Antioch is almost out of food after that prolonged siege the Crusaders themselves put it under. 4, the day before they took Antioch, Stephen of Blois just decided that everything was hopeless and abandoned the crusade, for which he would be mocked for the rest of his days.
And if you didn't already catch, the other day, when they first mentioned Stephen of Blois, I mentioned that he eventually becomes king of England, and I was confusing this Stephen with his son, who was also known as Stephen of Blois, and it was his son Stephen who becomes the king in England. So, and anytime that happens, because listen, I'm not watching these ahead of time, I'm not preparing anything, I'm just reacting very organically, and a lot of this stuff is just coming out of the top of my head from something I might have read 10 years ago. If there is something, and usually you guys are fantastic at catching things that I say that might not be correct or might be misleading in some way, I will usually pin a comment if I'm made aware of something to correct those things. So if you're watching this and you see a pinned comment, you might want to check that out, because that might clear up anything that I might say that might not be accurate. All about accuracy, all about wanting to make sure we're getting the right history here. So just keep that in mind anytime you watch any of my videos.
5, to compound his desertion, on his way back, Stephen ran into the Byzantine relief army and told them all hope was lost. So the Byzantines were like, okay, and promptly turned around to defend their own territory.
And this is part of the problem with the time in history that we're in, where there is no real good communication. It's not like he can say, okay, well, you know what? I'm not going to take your word for it. I'm going to go check for myself. It's not just as easy as that to do that. And so if you're meeting one of the retreating nobles, chances are you're going to accept his word on something like this. So, man, they talk a lot about this. I've never been in combat, anything like that, but you hear these stories about how fear can be infectious, and having one guy on the front lines or one guy in a prominent position of influence who loses hope, that can infect the other guys, and suddenly, instead of one guy who's lost hope and is afraid, now everybody's lost hope and they're afraid, and you've got to get somebody like that out of there.
So there would be no Byzantine reinforcements arriving. But for 4 straight days, the Turks assaulted the walls, and for 4 days, the beleaguered Crusaders held. Bohemond desperately racing between containing the Turks in the citadel and trying to hold the wall. Godfrey rallying the troops. The Turks attacked in waves to keep their forces fresh, but there were already too few Crusaders to hold the great ramparts, and so they fought without relief. After 4 days of vicious combat, the Turks decided, you know what, let's just starve these guys out. So, once again, starvation set in, and Crusader morale began to drop. Things looked bleak, but then, a sign. An impoverished local mystic claimed to have had a vision of St. Andrew telling him where the lance of Longinus, the holy lance that supposedly pierced Christ's side, was buried.
Interesting story about that. So first of all, if you're not religious, if you haven't grown up in church or anything like that, the story in the Gospels is that this, I'm going to try to keep this from being really long here, but crucifixion was a particularly gruesome way to execute somebody, and the way you typically died was that you suffocated, because the nature of being hung on the cross was that all the weight was kind of pushing down on your diaphragm. You could breathe in, but it was really difficult to breathe out, and so you would have to push up on the nails on your feet, put all your weight on, and push up to be able to exhale. And eventually you would just suffocate your body, and sometimes it would take 2 or 3 days for this to happen. But with the next day being the Jewish Sabbath, a lot of rules about burying and touching corpses and all these kinds of things. Anyway, long story short, they came around to break the legs of the prisoners. Because that was a way to hasten death. If your legs are broken, you can't push up anymore, and you would very quickly die. And so when they came to break Jesus' legs in the Gospels, it says it looked like he was already dead, so to make sure, they shoved a spear into his side, and it says blood and water came out from the wound in his side, and it was obvious that he was already dead. The spear has become one of those relics that has been sought after, like the Holy Grail and things like that. And in fact, there are stories from World War II of Adolf Hitler supposedly wanting to, or even actually succeeding in getting his hands on the Spear of Longinus.
So the Crusaders started to dig a big hole in the floor of the Church of St. Peter in Antioch. The mystic jumped down into the pit, and lo and behold, he pulled out a hunk of iron. "We found it," he said, "the head of the Lance of Longinus." Bohemond and Tancred were skeptical, and Bishop Adhemar was having none of it.
And these relics have been a long part of history. Supposedly, I want to say it was Justinian, like his mother, I think, that was sent to start, and she started claiming she found all these relics in Jerusalem, like they found pieces of the true cross, and she was the one who had the Church of the Holy Sepulchre built, which was built over the site that was supposedly Jesus' tomb. And so at this time in history, relics are a big deal, and everybody claimed to have a piece of the cross. Everybody claimed to have the bones of some saint, and this is no different than that.
They already had one of those Holy Lance things back in Rome, but the ordinary soldiers were inspired. Raymond declared it a sign that they would prevail. 13 days later, with food running out, the gaunt and wild-eyed Crusaders rode out of the gates to attack the Turks. Carrying the Lance of Longinus, and with the fervor of men otherwise doomed, the Crusaders let out a great yell and charged the vastly superior Turkish force. 6 columns of men, each led by one of the lords of the Crusade, poured out of the city gates and slammed into the Turkish line. Later, soldiers would speak of having seen the saints riding amongst them, carrying banners of white and riding steeds like snow.
They might have just been hallucinating from lack of food. No, but think about this. I mean, try to imagine this moment. It reminds me a lot of the scene, the kind of fictionalized version of the battle at the end of Braveheart, where it says, Scotsmen, starving and outnumbered, charge the fields of Bannockburn. They fought like warrior poets. They fought like Scotsmen and won their freedom, and they charge and throw in William Wallace's sword, and it sticks perfectly in the ground. And Robert the Bruce saying, "You bled with Wallace, now bleed with me." I think of all of that. These guys starving and outnumbered and surrounded, charging out of the city with their religious fervor and believing in what they're doing and charging out. What a scene that must have been.
And with desperation they fought. The Turks lit a great fire to drive them back, but through flame and smoke they fought on, until at last, against all odds, the Turkish line collapsed. The Crusaders fell upon the Turkish camp and the stores held there. The Crusade had survived. Unbeknownst to the Crusaders, though, they'd had one advantage. While the Turkish host appeared to them to be one mighty army, it was actually, like the crusading force, made up of many smaller armies with their own commanders. And it turns out that many of those commanders would have rather seen the Crusaders keep Antioch than have it fall into the hands of their superior. So as soon as the battle began to turn, many of them used it as an excuse to just desert and flee. But no matter the cause, the Crusaders had overcome the last great obstacle between them and Jerusalem.
Like we've been saying, coalitions are hard to keep together when people have competing desires and competing aims and goals and hopes. And so that's why when coalitions are successful and hold together, that should not be understated as a major achievement.
Now the crusade would be complete in no time, right? Not exactly. Raymond and Bohemond immediately began to dispute who would get to keep Antioch. Bohemond, always a little slyer than Raymond, eventually won out, after months and months of arguing while the crusade languished in Antioch. During that time, Hugh was sent off to talk to the Byzantine Empire about rejoining the crusade, but Hugh was never Alexius's favorite, and his pleas seemed to have little impact. So what did Hugh do? Instead of returning to the crusade, as originally planned, he basically said, "Well, I'm out. Peace," and wandered off back to Europe, for which he would be mocked for the rest of his days. And that's not all. During the months spent sitting around Antioch, a sickness passed through the camp, and Bishop Adhemar took ill and died, leaving the crusade as a whole functionally leaderless. At this point, Raymond decided...
Remember, Bishop Adhemar, he's the papal legate, so he's the guy who's there representing the Pope who called this crusade in the first place. And so it's not just a symbolic thing. It's very much a, now what do? We don't have anybody to tell us like where God wants us to go next.
That he possessed the Holy Lance and thus should be leader, started the crusade south again. This decision was in some ways precipitated by one of the grimmest moments in the crusade, the siege of the nearby city of Marat. After massacring the local population, while Bohemond and Raymond disputed who owned the place, the Crusaders were reduced to such a state of hunger that even the Western chroniclers talk in appalled tones about them roasting and boiling the dead Turks to eat. So, with only one major incident of cannibalism behind him, Raymond came to the conclusion that he had been ordained by God to lead the crusade south toward Jerusalem, and started trekking through the country. But only Tancred and Robert of Normandy agreed to follow. Jerusalem was in Shia hands at this point in time, so the crusade actually passed through most of the countryside without incident. The local Sunni population even helped supply them in the hopes that the Crusaders would both leave them alone and give the Shia a good kicking. But then Raymond decided that he needed to attack the town of Arca.
And before you pass judgment and say, well, why in the world would one group of Muslims turn on the other ones or allow Christians to come through? Well, look at what happens later on. I mean, look what already has happened with Christians killing one another. You know, nobody's above this whole mess of my group's better than your group, and I'm going to do whatever I can to get ahead. And look later on what happens with things like the 30 Years' War, where you have Protestants and Catholics, which in some ways is a decent comparison of what's happening here, killing each other. So Christians killing fellow Christians is no different than Muslims allowing Christians to pass through to stick it to the other Muslims.
Which is pretty random, as it had no bearing on them getting to Jerusalem. Of course, it would have some bearing if you were secretly planning to subvert the crusade in order to take over Tripoli and set up a kingdom of your own there, but we'll never know if that was Raymond's true intention because he utterly failed. In fact, he failed so spectacularly that Tancred and Robert left him to go join Godfrey, whom Raymond promptly asked for help. The combined Robert, Tancred, Godfrey army showed up, but it still wasn't enough to prosecute the siege, so the crusade just kinda stalled out again. Until a clergyman in Godfrey's army basically challenged the mystic who had found the Holy Lance to a monk duel, and the mystic agreed to undergo an ordeal by fire. Tragically, said mystic was not protected by God during the ordeal and burned to death, and the lance was discredited. Most of Raymond's credibility had come from possessing that lance, and now, since the lance was no longer a sacred object, thanks to the clergy beatdown, Godfrey took over and said, "Let's get back to going south toward Jerusalem, huh?" So, without further incident, other than one moment where Tancred popped over to conquer Bethlehem just real quick, the Crusaders
Bethlehem is, traditionally, it's called the City of David. It was King David's hometown. It's also the place that historically, that traditionally, Jesus was born. It's right outside of Jerusalem. It's like a couple of miles from Jerusalem. It's very, very close.
Finally made it to Jerusalem. But by this point, the crusade was in tatters. Baldwin was up in Edessa doing his own thing. Hugh had abandoned the crusade. Bohemond was holding down Antioch. The Byzantines were just done with the whole affair. Stephen had run...
And they were the ones who started this whole thing, the Byzantines, but he's realizing that he's not getting things the way he wanted them.
...off, and Adhemar was dead. There weren't really a lot of crusaders left to do the besieging. To add to this, the Fatimid forces holding the city had poisoned all the nearby wells, so the Crusaders were also rapidly succumbing to thirst. The remaining princes decided they'd have to take Jerusalem by assault or not at all.
And yes, as many of you mentioned, that is scorched earth policy. When I was using the term yesterday talking about biological warfare, I wasn't really meaning it in the strictest sense. I was just kind of loosely talking about how it compares to things we do today.
No way they could maintain a siege. But there was still one other problem. The surrounding countryside had been stripped bare. There was no lumber to build siege towers or scaling ladders. Things looked pretty hopeless. But just then, a group of Genoese ships arrived at a nearby port and saved the day. The Genoese agreed to dismantle their ships and bring the timber as quickly as possible to Jerusalem. The crusade wasn't over yet. The siege towers began to rise. On July 13th, 1099 CE, the assault on Jerusalem began.
And for those not familiar with this too, CE is the term that is used more recently, it's a more secular term, means Common Era. BCE is before Common Era, replacing the more religious terms BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord, not after death.
The Crusaders split into two forces, one led by Raymond, the other, on the opposite side of the city, led by Godfrey and Tancred. As Raymond's tower began to roll forward, it was battered and nearly destroyed. Raymond's assault had failed, but Godfrey and Tancred had been far more crafty. Like Raymond, they too had been erecting a siege tower on their side, and seeing this, the defenders had prepared their defenses all along the wall facing it. But unlike Raymond, the night before the assault, Godfrey and Tancred had disassembled and rebuilt their siege equipment in front of a totally different part of the wall. When the assault began, the section of the wall they attacked was completely unprepared. Still, the fighting swayed back and forth. For 2 days, the Crusaders assaulted the walls, and for 2 days they were held back. Raymond's tower was burnt to the ground, and many of the siege engines were smashed. But at last, Godfrey's tower reached the wall. Godfrey and Tancred were among the first to cross. The battle along the wall was hard fought.
Yeah, you gotta say this for these crusading lords.
Godfrey...
As much as they were in it for themselves and wanted, glory and riches and land and all of those things, and certainly had their selfish reasons for doing this, they're still on the front lines. They're still fighting. And that's what they often say, people like Dick Winters, that many people revere from Easy Company in World War II. One of the reasons they revered him so much and they were willing to follow him is because even though he was the leader, even though he was the boss, he was the first guy. He would never ask people to do something he wasn't willing to do himself, and that's what makes a great leader. And so these guys are right there, man. They're some of the first ones off the siege tower. They could have been at the bottom, letting everybody else go first, but they're right there fighting.
Godfrey and Tancred were among the first to cross. The battle along the wall was hard fought. No grand strategy or clever maneuvers, just a desperate melee that resolved down to a few hundred instances of men locked in single combat. But in the end, the Crusaders won out and opened the city gates. Now, with forces pouring in from all sides, the Muslim defenders broke and fled into the city. Victorious, the Crusader army began the biggest massacre the Holy Land had ever seen. Men, women, and children were slain as they ran through the streets. The chroniclers describe Crusaders wading ankle-deep in blood through Jerusalem as they butchered all those they could find. Only the youngest of the crusading princes, Tancred, tried to stop the slaughter, going so far as to give a group of Muslims his banner and telling them to show it to anybody who came for them to let them know that they were under his protection. But even this was...
So, on the one hand, it's very difficult to judge people based on our own modern-day sense of what is right and wrong, and it's easy to look at that and think, man, they're slaughtering innocent people. That's wrong. Other people will say, and I agree to a degree with this, well, we can't really judge that based on things today because back then that's just how things were. But even in the middle of that, you can look and you can see people like this man who's saying this is wrong. So even then, even with their mindset of 1,000 years ago, even with the way things were, you have people saying, no, killing innocent people is not okay. Stop this.
Was futile. Tancred was called off to attend to some other part of the fighting, and when he returned, those he'd offered protection to were dead upon the mosque floor. There would be one more battle outside of Jerusalem, but this was pretty much it. That's how the Crusaders retook the Holy Land. And thus, the First Crusade ended.
Okay, really fascinating stuff. Obviously, there's a lot more to the story with subsequent crusades, and it goes back and forth. And you've got the story of men like Saladin, we'll definitely get into all that at some point because I definitely want to learn more about this time period than I do. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. If you have any suggestions about what you'd like to see me do next, let me know that. I think we'll probably do some D-Day stuff this week just because of the anniversary coming up. But I am always open to your suggestions. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.